It's my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Edward Lee. He is the author of a book that's coming out, or is out, called Plato and the Nerd. So we're very excited to hear him speak this afternoon. So Edward Lee is a professor of electrical engineering and computer sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught and researched digital technology and computer science for more than 30 years. He was born and grew up in Puerto Rico and studied at Yale, MIT, and Berkeley. He has co-authored several textbooks on topics including digital communication, signal processing, embedded systems, and software modeling. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Lee today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm actually, not used to doing these kinds of things. I give a lot of technical talks, and I've never been asked to come give a talk about any of my textbooks, and I'm not that used to this experience about talking about my books. But hopefully, this will be a friendly audience, and I'll encourage lots of questions and discussions. I wanted to start by just telling you why I wrote this book. I was actually on sabbatical in 2015 to 2016, and I spent the fall semester writing software, which is one of my favorite hobbies, and mostly trying to avoid campus politics, and sort of reemerged in the early spring of 2016 at a time when our department was really going through some real stresses because of tremendously increased interest and demand among students and the general public around computer science. And in February of 2016, I went to a faculty meeting where there were some pretty emotional discussions about the future of the field and our department and how it was going to adapt to this changing landscape. And I came to the realization that pretty much nobody in the room, myself included, had a really good understanding of how the technology that we were involved in comes about. And so I decided at that point that I really needed to start a project to try to figure this out. And this book is what emerged from that. It was a pretty intensive project. I basically put everything aside and spent 9 months doing pretty much nothing else. My grad students were unhappy because I was largely ignoring them during that time and hiding out. But it had to be written quickly, I think, because in some ways it's a fairly tightly woven book with a lot of interleaving ideas. And I think that if it had taken me longer to write it, it would have been much harder to write because I would have forgotten what I had talked about elsewhere in the book. So on the pressures on the institution were one of the motivating factors, but corresponding with that was, of course, the pressure in our society and culture. And I think, this has been accelerating ever since I finished this book. I mean, you may have heard Vladimir Putin's speech that he gave to more than 1 million school children in Russia in September of this year, where, he said whoever becomes leader in artificial intelligence will become the ruler of the world. Pretty scary statement coming from a guy like that. And then, of course, Elon Musk has been getting a lot of publicity where, he says essentially that AI represents an existential threat to humanity, and he's, calling for government regulation. And I guess a key question here is, how do you regulate something you don't understand? And I think that, we've seen efforts to regulate things that we don't understand. For example, look at our completely ineffective regulations around privacy. And I think that that's largely because actually nobody understands the relationship between privacy and technology. And so how can you build regulations around things that you don't quite understand? So really my goal in this book was to try to help start a conversation around how technology gets created by humans and how it evolves in our culture. And the word evolves is a carefully chosen one here. Here's a nice picture, I think, that sort of presents one of the doomsday scenarios where, humanity will evolve itself out of existence. What my book is really focused on is where we are today, and an effort to try to understand this part where we're actually working on creating technology. And so, a big question that we have to address, if we want to address this doomsday scenario, for example, is, will artificial intelligence exceed human intelligence? Now, one problem with that, of course, is it's a really difficult question, because you can't even begin to answer that question until you know what intelligence is, and I don't think anyone knows what intelligence is. I don't think we're going to actually ever be able to nail that down. And so, but there's a much simpler question that we can ask and answer very easily, which is, will machines exceed humans? And the answer to that question is obviously yes, they already have, in many dimensions, right? I mean, the Industrial Revolution had them exceed us in physical strength and precision of manipulation of physical objects, but even more recently, functions that we have traditionally considered cognitive functions like memory and information management. Compare the amount of short-term memory that I have here compared to the amount of short-term memory that this iPhone has, and you realize that it blows me out of the water, right? And in fact, it becomes an extension of my brain and a tool to me that in fact, I believe makes me smarter. So that's an interesting perspective, because if this is really an extension of my brain in some way, maybe we shouldn't be thinking of it as just a completely separate, independent development. So let me talk briefly about the title of the book. The publisher hated the title, and they tried desperately to get me to change it, and I brainstormed with them quite a lot. We came up with a lot of alternative titles. I think the best alternative title that they came up with was The Map and the Territory, but there's a wonderful novel with that title that's really quite popular, and Alan Greenspan wrote a book just published in 2016 with that title, and so I felt like that was not going to work. But this title is a little bit edgy, and I think that was what the publisher didn't like about it. But it's actually very important to the theme of the book, so I'd like to try to explain it. So what the title is trying to do is put into opposition two ideas about facts and truths about the world. So the Platonic idea is that facts and truths about the world exist independent of humans in some Platonic heaven, waiting for humans to discover them. So discovery is the goal of all of our intellectual enterprise around science and technology, is to discover things that already exist in that Platonic heaven, okay? If you buy into that philosophy and you think about artificial intelligence as a discovery process, we're discovering the mechanisms around intelligence, then in some sense, the individual engineers who are working on this technology abdicate responsibility for the facts and truths that they discover. Those facts and truths exist independent of them. If they don't discover them, someone else will discover them sometime later, okay? Because they exist independent of humans. So that idea of facts and truths sort of existing independent of humans, waiting to be discovered, is on one side of this opposition in the title. On the other side of the opposition is the nerd. And the nerd here is a quirky, creative force who creates facts and truths that didn't exist before in any Platonic heaven or anywhere else. These are things that simply didn't exist. And they come into existence in part because of the creative energy that this particular, quirky force of the nerd does to bring them into existence. And if you adopt that perspective, then you cannot abdicate responsibility for the facts and truths that get created. You are responsible for them, and in fact, we collectively are responsible for them. So it's pretty important when you're thinking about policy decisions, which of these two perspectives you're going to adopt, and of course, I think there's a very strong tension between them. The picture here, which appears in the book, comes from a fresco that hangs in the Vatican by Raphael, and it's got Plato on the left pointing to the heavens, essentially alluding to this Platonic world that exists independent of humans waiting to be discovered. And then his student Aristotle is on the right, and Aristotle is sort of gesturing towards the earth. And Aristotle's perspective was that, well, no, actually the things that we learn, we discover by inferring them from observations about the physical world. Okay, so in essence, Aristotle was an advocate of building models out of observations of the physical world. which is really quite different from discovering things that already exist independent of humans. So this tension is represented in this fresco by Raphael, and so this tension is a pretty old standing concept. Now the subtitle of the book is much more explicit about kind of the agenda of the book, right, which is it's about what I call a creative partnership between humans and technology. And this image is suggestive of a feedback loop where humans are creating technology, but technology is also creating humans. Technology very strongly shapes our thought, okay? And it's our thought that then leads to improvements in technology. And so this feedback loop is a really big emphasis in the book. Now, very intertwined with this question about, Plato versus the nerd is the question of science versus engineering. I think many of us, I certainly have always come with the preconception that science was about discovery of these Platonic truths, and engineering was about creating things that didn't exist before. So clearly there's sort of a reflection of this tension between Plato and the nerd in science and engineering. So you may know, my book talks about the LIGO project, which was still stands as the National Science Foundation's most expensive research project, with well over $1 billion spent on it. And so LIGO is the Laser Interferometry Gravitational Observatory. And of course, at the time that I wrote this book, I didn't know that they were going to get the Nobel Prize for it. Just 3 weeks ago, I think, the Nobel Committee announced that Rainer Weiss at MIT and 2 colleagues at Caltech got the Nobel Prize in physics. And I want to read you the citation for the Nobel Prize. It says, quote, "For decisive contributions to the LIGO detector and the observation of gravitational waves." Now, when I first heard that citation, it surprised me, because the first part of the citation, decisive contributions to the LIGO detector, is an acknowledgement of an engineering enterprise. The LIGO detector fundamentally is an engineering enterprise. Let me explain a little bit what it is. Okay, so this is a picture of there's 2 of these detectors that have been built in the US, and there's one in Italy now that just recently came online. And this one is in Louisiana, and it's got 2 4-kilometer long high vacuum tubes going out at right angles to one another. So this is 4 kilometers long. And what the detector does is measure the distance between one end of the tube and the other. And when a gravitational wave passes through, according to Einstein's theory, the distance will change because space-time gets distorted. Interestingly enough, for the gravitational waves that we expect to see, the distance gets distorted by a tiny fraction of the diameter of a proton. So you have to measure a difference over a 4-kilometer length in distance that is a tiny fraction of the diameter of a proton. And the LIGO detector does this using laser interferometry, which is an old technique that dates back to the invention of the laser. Back in the 1970s, people were doing laser interferometry. So that wasn't a particularly new thing. But the ability to make that measurement at that level of precision was the key contribution here. That's an engineering contribution. Nothing was discovered. Okay, the laser interferometry technique was not discovered as part of this project. Neither were gravitational waves, which were pretty much known to exist. Nobody disputed their existence. If this instrument had failed to discover them, that would not have led to anyone doubting Einstein's theory about gravitational waves. So it was the engineering of this fabulously precise instrument, which then created, in a sense, a new telescope into the universe. So the instrument enabled the observation of gravitational waves, which has led to some science, some actual discoveries, because it started, the first measurement of a gravitational wave was right around the time I started working on the book in February 2016. And they've detected a whole bunch of them since then. And these gravitational waves come from colliding black holes. And so there's actually been new science that has come out of this, which is discovering the fact that black holes are colliding a lot more than people had expected, because we're seeing a lot of these things happening over just a short period of 1.5 years so far. So this is an example where an engineering enterprise actually preceded the science that came from that, okay? And the Nobel Committee has actually acknowledged and given a Nobel Prize, at least in part, for the engineering contribution of this. So this takes us to this question of, well, what is this relationship between discovery and invention? Well, in this case, there wasn't even an invention. This was really design, right? But discovery and invention are a key part of this tension as well. So if I ask anyone in this room, who invented the transistor, you'd probably tell me, well, it was these three guys, Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley. They invented it at Bell Labs in the late 1940s, okay? And they got the 1956 Nobel Prize for this work. And in that citation for the Nobel Prize, the way the citation read was that they got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the transistor effect. The discovery of the transistor effect. Now, to my knowledge, no one has ever seen the transistor effect in nature, okay? So they discovered something that didn't exist. That's a little weird, okay? But nevertheless, that's what they got the Nobel Prize for. But interestingly, if you delve into the history, in 1930, Julius Lilienfeld was issued a patent for the field effect transistor. He didn't call it that, okay? But if you go back and read the patent, it was a field effect transistor. So the transistor was invented 20 years before it was discovered. And that's even stranger, right? You don't get patents for discoveries, and you don't get Nobel Prizes for inventions. So there's something a little odd going on here, and I think that if you look under the hood at many discoveries and inventions, you'll find that they're similarly messy. We like to, as a culture, simplify them because we like to associate, heroes with wonderful things that happen in our culture, and we identify these heroes, but I think that that's more of a cultural phenomenon than a real reflection of what's going on. Usually things are much more messy than that. So in science and engineering both heavily use models. It's all about models. Scientists are creating models that are descriptions of the physical world, and in science, the value of a model lies in how well its behavior matches that of a physical system. That's the purpose for science, is to build models that match the behavior of physical systems. But I had a bit of an epiphany that I find actually a little bit embarrassing, because I've been working in engineering for 30 years, more than 30 years, and I realized in the process of writing this book that I thought I was doing one thing, but I was actually doing something quite different, okay, that entire time. I thought I was doing this. I thought I was doing science in this sense, where the goal was to construct models that were good descriptions of the physical world. But what I was really doing is better reflected by this. In engineering, the value of a physical system lies in how well its behavior matches that of a model, okay? If I give you a model of a digital circuit, okay, and I give you a piece of silicon that doesn't match that model, then that piece of silicon is junk. It doesn't say anything about the model being junk, but the piece of silicon itself is junk, okay? So the goal of a circuits engineer is to construct a piece of silicon that behaves like that model. This is kind of the mirror image use of models compared to the scientific use of models. And one of the things that I realized was that both engineers and scientists use models both ways, but most of the time they don't know which way they're using it. They might be using a model this way and they think they're using it this way, or vice versa, okay? But I think that we don't generally explicitly examine the question of what the role is of this model that we're using in some engineering or scientific enterprise. So another way to describe this issue is that, a scientist asks, can I make a model for this thing? Whereas an engineer asks, can I make a thing for this model? If you look at the LIGO detector, which of those was it doing? Well, the enterprise of constructing the LIGO detector was clearly the second, not the first, okay? The model already existed. Einstein had created the model for the gravitational waves, and various people had created the models for laser interferometry Those already existed. The LIGO enterprise was to make a thing for the model, not to make a model for the thing. So another way to think about this is that a scientist will try to shrink the number of relevant models. These are the models that are needed to explain the physical world. An engineer does the reverse. An engineer tries to grow the number of relevant models, which are the models for which you can build a faithful physical thing. The more physical things we can make to match a richer set of models, the more successful our engineering enterprise is. So these are really quite complementary disciplines, and in fact, I mean, they're not separate disciplines, right? I think every scientist does engineering in this sense, and every engineer does science in this sense. But we need to have a better understanding of which of those we're doing when. So, is the process of building models a rational, systematic, and logical process? I think that if you go back to kind of the philosophy of Karl Popper, the philosophy of science that I think has dominated the discipline, you say, yes, actually everything should be completely objective. Put aside the subjective aspects of it, and the more objective you can make it, the better off we are. And making it objective is about making it rational, systematic, and logical. Well, I think you all know about Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote from 2002. This was during the Iraq War, where he talked about, well, we have the known knowns, we have the known unknowns, the things we know we don't know, but then we have the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know, okay? And he said those were the real problem that the DoD was dealing with in Iraq. But he left out an obvious fourth category, which is the unknown knowns. These are the things you know, but you don't know you know them, okay? We all have them. In fact, they're very much a part of our thinking. We know things we don't know we know. And of course, this philosophy was very nicely expressed by Thomas Kuhn, who was very much in opposition with Karl Popper in kind of the latter part of the 20th century in this philosophy of science. And Thomas Kuhn was kind of rocked the boat in science by saying, actually, this idea of doing science completely objectively doesn't work very well. In fact, science is always done within this backdrop of what he called paradigms, which are these unknown knowns. These are the things you don't know you know, but they form your whole backdrop for your way of thinking, and they create a very subjective element in science. Well, in my book, I examine how similar kinds of subjective elements come into play in technology. So let's look at digital circuit technology. So this is a picture of a transistor. This picture actually comes from a transistor that was made one floor down from my office in Berkeley in a microlab that we have on the fourth floor of Corey Hall. And this was made in 2001. And it was an invention of a new style of field effect transistor called a FinFET. Basically, you can see why they called it a FinFET, because this gate looks a little bit like a fin. And in fact, the whole idea of this transistor was to exploit the third dimension, the vertical dimension, in the layout of circuits. Okay? And they showed that you could make extremely small transistors with a gate width of 20 nanometers. So nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters. Okay? So this is 2001. And today, most modern fabs implement FinFETs of approximately this dimension. They're down to around 14 nanometer gate widths, but very close to what we were doing in 2001 in this lab one floor down from me, okay? So it's taken since between 2001 and now to commercialize this technology. But if you think about it, a 20 nanometer dimension, how many 20 nanometer objects can you fit in a centimeter squared? A lot, okay? A lot. So how do you design a chip out of 20 nanometer components, right? Well, what we do in engineering is we layer abstractions. So the first layer above this is we use the Mead-Conway approach to talk about layouts more abstractly than to talk about the specific 3D geometry of the chips. We introduce design rules that constrain what you can do, okay? Above that, we talk about transistors as single elements, and we idealize them as switches. Above that, we think about logic gates, which are collections of transistors, and we think of them as idealized, operating on zeros and ones. Above that, we build digital designs. This is an arithmetic and logic unit, a 4-bit arithmetic and logic unit that you can think of as a unit and build designs out of that. Above that, you can build an instruction set architecture. And above that, you build a chip. And this particular die photograph is from Intel, and that's Intel the company, not Intel as in some of what you guys deal with. But each die here is about 1.7 centimeters squared and has 1.4 billion transistors in it. 1.4 individually switchable electrical switches, okay? And my essential claim is that the distance between that individual transistor and this design is huge. And at each of these layers, there's a lot of culture. And I can't use any other word for it. It is culture. It's a culture around an engineering enterprise. The way that we end up thinking about these designs is shaped and becomes part of our unknown knowns, okay? When we think of digital logic designs, there's this huge backdrop of unknown knowns that were created by people that came along before us, and we just take them for granted, and we use them in the next layer above that. And that's just the hardware side. When you build on top of that the software, you have several more layers of abstraction on top of that, and those start to get really quirky, okay? So one of my essential claims in this book is that software is in fact quirky and idiosyncratic, and yet it shapes thought, right? So here's a program. Does anyone recognize the language that program is written in? There must be people in the room old enough to recognize that language. This is APL. This is an APL program. When I was a computer science student at Yale, we had an entire room outfitted with keyboards that had been modified to have, you know, this, I don't even know what you call it, this slashed triangle was one of the keys on the keyboard because you needed to be able to type these in order to be able to enter the APL programs. So extremely compact. Grace Hopper here was an advocate at the time of moving in entirely the opposite direction and making computer programs that were very human readable. And she's often credited with the creation of COBOL, although a lot of other people contributed to COBOL as well. But she did create a predecessor to COBOL and was a very forceful advocate of this idea of programs that you could read almost like prose, okay? Very different perspective on how to construct programs. And the fact is that if you look at the history of programming languages, it's quite a rich cultural history because each of these programming languages represents a way of thinking about algorithms, and it shapes the thinking of the designers that use these programming languages. So this is not objective, dispassionate discovery of Platonic truths. That's not what it is. This is quirky, creative enterprises that create things that didn't exist before and that have personality and culture in them. So Richard Dawkins, who is a evolutionary biologist, wrote this very famous book, The Selfish Gene, sold more than 1 million copies, quite a few more than mine will ever sell. But in this book, he coined the term memes for essentially ideas that propagate, okay? So thoughts, language, things that propagate from human to human that we learn from one another, okay? And he talks about an evolutionary process, a kind of Darwinian evolution for these memes. But his analogy with Darwinian evolution is a little bit weak. I mean, and he acknowledges this. He says it's just an analogy. Don't think of this too literally, although the term memes is meant to suggest genes. So he obviously picked the term carefully to have some connection with the notion of genetic evolution. But memes are not living things. They do not exist independent of humans, right? A meme can only exist in our heads, and it can be propagated through written language and so on, but it propagates from head to head, and it's a very transitory thing. If the human dies, the meme dies with it, okay? In software, however, we're creating things that are like memes in that they represent ideas that can propagate, but they actually do take on a life of their own. And in fact, software systems can operate for a while, independently of humans, and they actually have a little bit more of a character that almost makes them look like living things, right? They react to stimulus around them. They need nutrition. They draw their nutrition from the power grid, right? So they're mostly consuming fossil fuels. But they're able to, they're processes that react to stimulus and produce responses. And of course, they're very intertwined with humans. Their existence is very tightly intertwined with humans. But you can talk about the evolution of these things much more literally than you can talk about the evolution of memes because of this ability that they have to exist and proceed somewhat independently of humans. And of course, that independence from humans may be accelerating. And in fact, one of the fearful scenarios that many of the dystopian thinkers talk about is where these software systems become completely independent of humans and are able to propagate themselves on their own without any help from us. Okay, and that may happen, I don't know, but the fact that we're even talking about it suggests that we really should be thinking about these things as processes that can evolve and co-evolve with us. So, co-evolve. Persistent processes taking care of themselves with our help, of course, sensing our world and manipulating it, largely in our service so far, and co-evolving with humans, with our culture and even our bodies. So co-evolving. So this idea of co-evolving with humans is an idea that I got from George Dyson, who I understand was a speaker in this series. I've actually never met him, but I love this book that he wrote. I mean, I really recommend it if you haven't read it. He talks about Google's million-plus servers as a collective metazoan organism. I had to look up this word because, but it means multicellular. Okay, so and he pointed out that the companies and individuals who nurture the servers are ever more vividly rewarded in return, and that unemployment is pandemic among those not working on behalf of the machines. So this idea of the he says the big computer is doing everything in its power to make life as comfortable as possible for its human symbionts. So I had this experience. The very first time I rode an Uber was actually in the DC area. And I conjured up the Uber app on my phone, and this car appears. And the driver has his own phone, which has told him exactly where to go to find me, and tells him exactly where I'm going. And the driver, I get into the car, and he follows the directions without really even thinking about where I'm going, and drives me to where I'm going, and then drops me off, and I get out of the car. And I realized, as I was riding that car, that driver was part of a big machine. That in fact, that driver was simply the sensor system for the machine, and the low-level controller for doing the steering and the braking and accelerating for the machine. He was just part of that machine, and the driver's role was he was temporarily there until the machine could figure out how to do the sensing and the low-level control itself, right? But in the meantime, it needed humans to provide the sensing and the low-level control. But the overall high-level machinery was actually much bigger than that individual human. So if that isn't a symbiotic relationship, I don't know what is. So in my own book, just to read you a direct passage, I say, if computers and software form organisms, then they depend on us for their procreation. We provide the husbandry and serve as midwives. In exchange, we depend on them to manage our systems of finance, commerce, and transportation. But more interestingly, the machines make humans more effective at the very husbandry that spreads the software species. If any of you write software, right, what you do today when you run up against something that you're not quite sure how to do is you Google it. You try to come up with the most cogent explanation of what you'd like to accomplish with this JavaScript program or whatever. You Google it. Very likely it'll take you to a Stack Overflow website where you will have a discussion of a bunch of programmers, and the machine will facilitate this explanation to you about how to do this to further the machine. Okay? I love programming, and actually my programming productivity is orders of magnitude more today than it was 20 years ago. Writing code 20 years ago was much, much more difficult. I can write much more code, much more effective code, and a lot of the code I write is actually taking big pieces of software from here and combining them with big pieces of software from there and creating this new big piece of software. Whoa, that looks a little bit like what goes on with genes, okay? The human DNA is almost a perfect overlap of the mouse DNA. There's a lot of replicated functionality in there, just as there is a lot of replicated functionality in a lot of software that's out there. But the individual species are significantly different, even if the code base is maybe not that different. So software that survives and evolves, of course, survives and evolves if it provides some value to the humans, which is sort of suggestive of this symbiosis, right? If you start a company, for example, around some software idea, if your company fails, the software will very likely die. If your company succeeds, the software will very likely go on to procreate and mutate into new software later on, okay? And that starts to suggest a really strongly symbiotic coevolution, which is where this picture on the cover of my book starts to come into play. So to read you another quote from our book, right? You might think that artificial intelligence is about replicating human intelligence. That's the scientific enterprise. We're trying to build a scientific model, and the value of the model lies in how well it matches the physical system being what goes on in the human brain. So is that what's going on? Are we playing God, creating a new life form in our own image, or are we being played by a Darwinian evolution of a symbiotic new species? Are humans the purveyors of the noisy channel of mutation, facilitating sex between software beings by recombining and mutating programs into new ones? I just raised the question, okay? I don't know the answer to this, but I'm pretty sure the answer is not as clear as we might have assumed before. So again, I credit George Dyson, who observes that humans are evolving too. He says, Facebook defines who we are, Amazon defines what we want, and Google defines what we think. So Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, said he wanted Google to be the third half of our brain. And I have to say that it's probably pretty much the third half of my brain. I would miss it a lot if I was locked into a room for a whole week without being able to use it, because it would really cramp my style for my intellectual activity. Dyson goes even further and creates this somewhat scary proposition. He says, are we using digital computers to sequence, store, and better replicate our own genetic code, thereby optimizing human beings? Or are digital computers optimizing our genetic code and our way of thinking so that we can better assist in replicating them? Now, I personally don't really like the way this is expressed, because it suggests there's some purpose to what is going on here. And in Darwinian evolution, there's no need for purpose, okay? Purpose is not part of Darwinian evolution. And, but you can say, well, there is this notion of facilitated evolution, right? Obviously, if humans are crafting software, and if we ultimately view that software as an evolutionary process, humans are obviously affecting that evolutionary process, right? So if we're affecting it, consciously changing it, is it still evolution? I think it is. I think if you take a neo-Darwinian approach, facilitated evolution is still evolution. And I cite work on the Cambrian explosion. So you may know about this. It's not very recent history, about 540 million years ago. There was a very short period of time, about 20 million years, over which the number of species on Earth exploded. And in fact, scientists estimate that that the number of multicellular organisms, species of multicellular organisms at the end of that 20 million year period was about twice what exists on Earth today, just in number of species, okay? And it went essentially from 0 to twice as many as we have today in a very short period of time. And Andrew Parker, in 2003, published a book called In the Blink of an Eye, where he postulated a theory for how this came about. He calls it the light switch theory, And he said that it was essentially the emergence of sight that caused this Cambrian explosion. So it started with just cells being able to respond to light in a very elementary way, and very quickly evolved into eyes. Within that 20 million year period, fully formed human-like eyes had come into being, okay, in a very short period of time. And his thesis was that the reason that this accelerated the evolution was because it enabled predation. It enabled species to go, whereas before, you'd be a single-cell organism sitting there, and whenever nutrients happened to float by, you would gobble them up, right? But once you had eyesight, you could actually proactively go after them, and you would kill off any of the ones that didn't manage to get away. So the ones that would manage to get away would themselves have eyes to be able to see you coming, and you get this very rapid feedback loop that was accelerated by the killing involved in predation. So death and evolution go hand in hand here, and they accelerate each other because, in a way, the predators accelerate the evolution of the prey and vice versa, okay? So how does this apply to intelligence? Well, again, quoting Dyson, so Dyson has a really interesting observation here. He says, the behavior of a search engine, talking about Google search engines, when not actively conducting a search, resembles the activity of a dreaming brain. Associations made while awake are retraced and reinforced, while memories gathered while awake are replicated and moved around. He points out then, in 1950, Turing asked us to consider the question, can machines think? Well, he says, not yet, but they're at the preliminary stage. They're dreaming. And that's going to be a predecessor to thinking. That's what he says. So dreaming, well, if dreaming in the past, at the time that Dyson wrote his book, Google was mostly operating on text. So they had this project, for example, to scan all the books in the world. And the main purpose for that was not to make those books available to us, but rather to feed those books to an AI, right, to learn about human language and human culture and human thought, okay? Well, in 2006, Google bought YouTube for $1.6 billion, and now Google can feed their AIs a huge treasure trove of videos about the world, which essentially means that the machines can dream in color and are learning things about much more than just language structure, and it's potentially quite drastic. So what happens when the software symbionts also start to directly sense and manipulate our physical world, as is happening in this whole move towards the Internet of Things, right? As we start feeding data from all the sensors that we have around us into these machines, and give them access to the actuators, so now they can actually, you can start to form feedback loops where the machines can stimulate things in the physical world and watch the reaction on the sensors and learn from that. That could be another potentially game-changing thing. So there's distinctly a possibility for an evolution happening here in the Darwinian sense. I don't mean this so many people who work in the software engineering world have talked about evolution to mean just gradual change. That's not what I mean here. In fact, evolution in the Darwinian sense need not be gradual. It can be quite quick. Darwin himself chronicled very short 3-year periods of speciation in the Galapagos, where over 3 years new species emerged, okay? So it's not about gradual. It's about the feedback loop of predation and procreation. So if there is this evolution happening, and humans are clearly playing a role in it, because obviously we are software engineers, we're writing software all the time, are we really crafting that software, or are we just part of a feedback loop? So Richard Dawkins, again, in his second truly wonderful book called The Blind Watchmaker, makes the case that evolution is much more powerful than top-down intelligent design. He says that evolution is capable of creating far more complex systems than you can with top-down intelligent design. And I think we're seeing that happening already in the technology that we have today. The fact is Most of the interesting programs out there, there is no single human being that really completely understands those programs. They're too complex for that. We've already exceeded that point where any single human being can completely understand what's going on with these interesting programs. So how far can this go? Well, in my book, I have two parts to the book, which are a yin and yang part, as I call them. And the yin part is more about what the limitations are, what computers cannot do. And I'm not going to spend much time on that because I want to leave time for questions and answers, but I wanted to give you just a quick overview of what's in that part of the book. So three of the key characters in that part of the book are Alan Turing, Claude Shannon, and Kurt Gödel. Now, Alan Turing, in the popular press these days, a lot of people keep saying he invented the computer. Alan Turing did not invent the computer, okay? One of Alan Turing's key contributions was to show that many different designs of computers are equivalent, okay? That was a key contribution. But an even more key contribution was that he showed that in that whole set of equivalent designs, that those machines cannot do certain things. So people mistake the idea, we have this notion of a universal Turing machine. And I see it all the time where people say, oh, that's a universal machine. It can do anything any other machine can do. That's not true, and it's not what Turing said, okay? In fact, Turing showed that these machines can't do a whole bunch of stuff. In fact, he showed that there's vastly more things they cannot do than what they can do, okay? The whole undecidability question is about the things they cannot do, and that was very much related to Kurt Gödel's contributions, which was about what formalisms, formal languages cannot do. The two are very much intertwined, and they're very much about the limitations of the technology, not about the capabilities of the technology. Claude Shannon talked about, he was the first guy, I think, to really quantify information. And so if you want to talk about information processing, and you need to talk about information processing to talk about cognition, I think, Claude Shannon is a good resource. But one of the interesting things that Claude Shannon did was also show us what we cannot do, okay? Claude Shannon showed that the amount of information that you can get from here to here is always limited. That in fact, there may be vastly more information here than you can ever convey. Because he showed that if you have any noise in the channel, and any channel has noise, okay, you're going to convey for each use of the channel only a finite number of bits of information. That doesn't mean that there's only a finite number of bits of information in the source. It just means that you can only convey a finite number of bits of information in any channel with noise. So again, this was about a limitation, and specifically a digital limitation. Information can only convey bits of information. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't information that's more than bits. And here, in the process of researching this, I ended up finding myself in this quagmire. It turns out that many physicists today actually believe that everything is bits. John Archibald Wheeler is one of the more famous advocates of this. He coined the term "it from bit." The entire physical world, this laser pointer, okay, is just algorithms operating on bits. Everything in the physical world is algorithms operating on bits. So some people call this thesis digital physics. The simplest form of that, it says that the number of possible states of a physical system is finite, which means that you can encode the state of any physical system in a finite number of bits. So I show in my book that these theses are not falsifiable. You cannot construct an experiment to prove them wrong, and therefore you can only take them on faith. They cannot be construed as a scientific theory because in order to falsify them, you have to invent a way to make noiseless measurements. And unless you can make noiseless measurements, you cannot falsify them. And I also show in the book that you can't make noiseless measurements unless you first assume that the world is digital, in which case you can, if it is digital, then it becomes possible to make noiseless measurements, which means that the thesis that it's digital is falsifiable only if the thesis is already true. Okay, so this has gotten me into trouble. Physicists don't like me. I have arguments with the physicists in my department. They really wish I wouldn't talk about this stuff. But one of the consequences is that what goes on in our heads okay? Is it digital? Well, let's talk about one aspect of cognition, which is simply, one aspect of cognition is self-awareness, right? I have this property in my brain of self-awareness. I know I do, right? It's sort of self-referential, but I have no idea whether any of you do. I can guess that you probably do, right? But nobody's ever figured out a way to measure someone else's self-awareness. Maybe that self-awareness is not digitally encodable, in which case, under the Shannon channel capacity theorem, it cannot be conveyed over a noisy channel, and therefore we will never be able to observe the self-awareness of anyone else, including we will never, if we build machines that are self-aware, we will never be able to observe their self-awareness directly either. We might guess that they have it, but we'll be stuck simply with guessing. So if cognition is in fact not a digital algorithmic process, then your mind is entirely your own, and you will never be able to upload it no matter what the singularity people tell you, okay? Because you have to overcome Shannon's limitation, and that's going to be tough to do. So the book then goes on to spend a little bit of time on what we can know. And one of my heroes here is Pierre-Simon Laplace, because he was an interesting guy. He said, in principle, we can know everything. Okay, we now know that's not true because of Kurt Gödel and Alan Turing, where showed very definitively there are things we can't know. Okay, but nevertheless, Pierre-Simon Laplace, even though he believed that we could know everything, he actually is the key developer of what is now called Bayesian probability, which is all about trying to understand how to deal with what you can't know and what you don't know. And so he was kind of hedging his bets. He said, in principle, we can know everything. In practice, we're not going to know everything, so let's find a way to handle what we can't know. And so he built this beautiful theory of probability that is now called Bayesian probability. Anyway, that's talked about in the book. So let's go back to artificial intelligence. This car should be ashamed of itself, okay? The fact is that, you can buy many late model cars that have these adaptive cruise control systems that if the system is turned on, they won't do this. If the system is turned off, they will happily do this. They will run at 60 miles an hour into the car in front of them. Why? I asked the car companies. We work with car companies. We're working with Toyota and Ford currently at Berkeley. And I asked them why, and they say, well, the regulatory structure and the liability laws and all this cultural stuff, they don't know how it's going to play out. My prediction, I make this prediction right here, is that one of them is going to get sued because someone got killed in a rear-end collision and the technology was in the car already that would have prevented that collision, and it just wasn't activated because they're afraid of liability laws. We need the culture to interact with the technology here to make sure that we fix that problem, because that's ridiculous. There's no excuse for that car running into this car that way today, okay? So this is about the interplay of technology and culture, which I think cannot be separated. On artificial intelligence, do we really want computers with human-like artificial intelligence? So one of my favorite NPR shows is Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And they had an episode just last weekend where they were making fun of a late model car because this car has a feature where it tries to strike up a conversation with you. And they were saying, this is like the most annoying Uber driver. You'd really rather he just shut up. You don't want to talk to him. And, but nevertheless, you can buy a car now that tries to strike up a conversation with you. Well, I'm not really sure we want that kind of human-like intelligence in our car, right? I mean, in quoting from my own book, I really don't want to have to argue with my car about getting to school on time. It's hard enough to have that argument with my daughter. Is human-like intelligence really the goal of artificial intelligence? In my view, it is not the goal, which is fortunate because it may be unachievable if, in fact, human intelligence isn't digital and algorithmic. We should really be after what I'd prefer to call artificial intelligence says, and I think that this is actually the biggest thing that the AI discipline is teaching us, is that actually intelligence is a very multifaceted issue. It's a very complex, very multifaceted issue. There's no such thing as a single intelligence, and this idea of a human intelligence on a linear scale as being sort of the ultimate, I think we're quickly learning that's not the ultimate. We're developing intelligences that are quite orthogonal to human intelligences, and I hope that we will do everything we can to evolve symbiotically with them rather than in competition. And that's where I think we need to be focusing our policies, is on ensuring symbiosis, keeping the goals of the technology aligned with the goals of the humans. That's, I think, the goal, and I hope that with this book, I will give people a better understanding of what's really happening so that we can then figure out how to nudge the process. I don't think we can control the process, but I think we can nudge it. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. All right. So where you ended up spawns a burning question. So if there's not a single type of intelligence that may come out, we've had talk in the past 15, 20 years about on human intelligence, moving away from strictly IQ-based quantitative intelligence, and there's discussions about emotional intelligence and artistic creativity, that kind of thing. How do you feel that kind of thing would map to our development of artificial intelligences?
I think that's a very good question, but I have to tell you, frankly, I don't understand humans. And I think you need to ask someone who's more of a sociologist about that. I think what I am willing to say is that I do believe that in a way that I have no idea whether it can be quantified, that technology has made me smarter. I think I am smarter than I was 20 years ago, in large part because of the technology that I'm able to use to leverage the limitations of my brain. I have a lousy memory. My ability to keep notes and search for them really easily, and to search for things that I've have only a vague recollection of, but can come up with a few, starting even just the first part of a keyword, and then Google fills in the rest of it for me. It's an amazing leverage that I get from my limited brain. And so in that sense, I think there's no question in my mind that the technology is making us smarter.
Yeah, imagine your score if you took a standardized IQ test with access to Google.
Right.
Do we have a model for when the machine knows more than us? And the background to the question is, so in the Bible, God makes man, and then God knows when man is becoming dangerous, and God says that I'll do this so that man doesn't get too bad. Do we know when the machines are getting too bad? Like, do we have a model that says that now we pull the plug?
Well, it partly depends on what you mean by knowing, but I would say the machines already know more than man. In fact, there's a famous quote, in fact, that even collectively, humans know more than any individual. Everybody knows more than anybody, is the quote. I can't remember who said that, but so, I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by knowing, but, if I think about what I know, it's a piddly, tiny little subfraction of what is interesting out there. The beauty of what we have today that we've never had before is that I can get access to things that I didn't know anything about, and I can learn about them relatively easily compared to what it used to be. I mean, in the process of chasing down this question of digital physics, I had to teach myself a bunch of quantum mechanics because I had never studied that in school. And it was a bit of a struggle, but the technology helped me a lot to learn quantum mechanics, and it was probably much, much easier for me to learn than it would have been, when I was in college.
So my follow-up real quick to that would be, shouldn't we then have a model for containment? Because if there's any possibility at all that the machine can know in some rudimentary way something that we don't know yet, shouldn't we have a model for containment that says that in the event that this thing gets smarter than us, that we will do X?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key question. And I think that's the question that Elon Musk is raising, is that what kind of containment can we put on the machines that will... I guess I would put the question more broadly. I wouldn't put it in terms of trying to quantify knowledge, because I think that's too difficult to do. I would put it in terms of making sure that the goals of the machines remain aligned with the goals of humans. Okay? I think what we want is to build in structure and policies that where we do the best we can to make sure that those goals remain aligned. One of the best advocates of that is a colleague of mine at Berkeley, Stuart Russell, who's a very famous AI researcher. He wrote a very widely used book that is almost the Bible of artificial intelligence, right? And he is an advocate of what people are calling safe AI, which is a research problem of how do you, in fact, design algorithms and machines such that their goals, as they continue to do things and evolve and learn, remain aligned with those of humans. And to me, this is a very nascent area. I don't think we know how to do this yet, but I think it's a really important area. And Stuart has been saying, we as researchers in the field need to take it seriously and start addressing that question head on. I see this as the next frontier for security, right? So the security world is all about dealing with bad guys, right? And keeping their effects out of information systems, for example. I think that the safe AI system is about making sure that the machines themselves don't become bad guys, right? And I think it's a non-trivial problem. It's hard to even frame the question. I think it's partly what, you're trying to frame it in a particular way, which I think is about as good as any I've heard, but it doesn't do it for me because I don't think quantity of knowledge is the issue. I think, having more knowledge has rarely proved to be a handicap. So, I would hope that we wouldn't start to establish policies that restrict the amount of knowledge that is accumulated.
We have one here.
Yes, sir. I have the great good fortune that about 40 years ago, I met Admiral Hopper, and I was absolutely impressed with her belief that simple is better. And, she does get credit for COBOL, but there was that huge team that actually did the work. Her philosophy being that if everything stayed at machine language, we'd never have enough people to program the computers to do the things that we needed to do, and we had to elevate it up. But in the concept of keeping it simple, and I think going to what you were saying, Isaac Asimov wrote 3 rules of robotics, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And it's interesting to watch today's discussion on ethics in connected vehicles and what is your car going to do if it knows it can't stop before it hits that truck, and if it swerves over that way, it only kills 2 people as opposed to killing 5 people. And how do you teach the car how to behave? The ethics in the machine. And how do you translate Asimov's 3 rules into an application for your car?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And this is, as you point out, something that's being hotly debated. The particular problem that you're addressing goes under the term the trolley problem. And I don't think anyone has a good answer for it. I think the fact that the discussion is happening is important. What I lament is that we're not putting in technology that we know could save tens of thousands of lives because we can't solve the trolley problem. That's unfortunate because the problem may not be solvable, but though the vast majority of accidents are not trolley problems. They're just human stupidity, right? There's, someone gets a text message from her boyfriend and it just can't resist and slams into the car in front of them and is killed. And that, to me, is sad. we have no excuse for not preventing that because we can't solve the trolley problem. It's just, that's a poor excuse. And that's certainly true. That happens occasionally.
It's been proven to not be true, but that's exactly what the fear mongers were putting forward as their forecast of reality. That the seatbelt would trap you in a car.
Yeah, so I don't have a solution to this problem, but I think that a key theme in my book, when I talk about coevolution of humans and technology, this is very much a part of it. I'm not talking about just the culture of software engineers, which is an interesting culture in and of itself, right? The programming languages they use, the tools they use, and so on. I'm also talking about the culture of the community that uses the technology. And I think that culture evolves along with the technology. And as with any evolutionary process, there's a lot of randomness and there's a lot of inertia to overcome. And if we simply understand that this is an evolutionary process, it's not a top-down intelligent design where we can just, bam, one policy is going to solve this whole problem, right? It's not like that. Really, you can nudge the process. You can nudge the culture, right? So seatbelt laws, for example, nudge the process. They don't, the car manufacturers did not initially put in the annoying beep, right, that made you fasten your seatbelt. But the law said you had to have a seatbelt. It had to be available in the car. And then the next generation of laws said, well, you had to be wearing the seatbelt. And then the next generation of laws said the car manufacturer had to put in an annoying beep. And that was an evolutionary process. And it had to be an evolutionary process. It couldn't just be designed. That's naive, okay? So that's maybe the key message of my book, is let's recognize that what's happening is actually a coevolutionary process, and when we understand that, we can learn how to nudge the process.
Thank you very, very much. It's very enlightening, and please accept this gift on our behalf, Edward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.